10 classic actors who lost everything to addiction, and nobody helped. Hollywood has always had two faces. The glamorous one it sells to the world, and the broken one it hides backstage. For decades, the industry took everything it could from its biggest stars, their talent, their time, their energy, and when addiction consumed them, it simply looked away. No intervention, no support, just silence, and a new name on the marquee. Today we're talking about 10 classic actors who lost everything to addiction, and the uncomfortable truth that in almost every case, nobody in power lifted a finger to help them. 10. Bela Lugosi gave the world one of cinema's most iconic performances. Dracula in 1931 made him a household name overnight. Audiences were terrified. Studios were thrilled. And for a brief moment, Lugosi was exactly where Hollywood wanted him. Profitable, bankable, and in demand. But Hollywood is a cruel place for aging stars. As the roles dried up, Lugosi fell into a deep dependency on morphine and Demerol, medications he had been prescribed for sciatica. The addiction quietly consumed him for years, while the industry he had made millions for offered nothing. No phone calls, no support, no intervention from the studio system that had profited from his face for 2 decades. In 1955, at 72 years old, he checked himself into a state hospital, becoming one of the first major celebrities to publicly admit addiction. He died just 1 year later. Hollywood showed up for his funeral. It hadn't shown up when he needed it. 9. Montgomery Clift was considered one of the finest actors of his generation. A peer of Marlon Brando and James Dean, critics called him the most naturally gifted of the three. Directors fought to cast him. He had everything the industry valued: talent, intensity, and an on-screen presence that was almost impossible to manufacture. Then in 1956, he survived a horrific car accident that permanently altered his face and shattered his confidence. The physical pain led to prescription pill dependency. The emotional pain led to alcohol. Studios continued casting him because he was still brilliant on screen, but nobody addressed what was happening off it. Colleagues watched, directors accommodated. The system kept moving because he was still useful. He died in 1966 at just 45 years old. His housekeeper found him. His industry had watched the decline for a decade and treated it as someone else's problem. 8. Veronica Lake was Paramount's biggest female star of the 1940s. That peekaboo hairstyle, that screen presence, she was impossible to look away from. At her peak, her image was so culturally powerful that the US government asked her to change her hairstyle, because factory women working wartime machinery were copying it and getting injured. But alcoholism took hold early, and as her behavior became unpredictable, Paramount simply dropped her contract. No treatment was offered. No support was provided. The studio that had used her face to sell millions of tickets walked away without looking back. By the 1950s, she was completely broke, working as a cocktail waitress in a New York hotel, where a journalist recognized her and published the story. The same industry that made millions from her image had discarded her completely. She died in 1973 from hepatitis caused by years of alcohol abuse. She was 50 years old. 7. John Barrymore was called the greatest actor of his era, possibly the greatest America had ever produced. His Hamlet was legendary, his film career was extraordinary, and his alcoholism was treated by Hollywood as entertainment. Directors worked around it. Co-stars joked about it, the press romanticized it. Nobody took it seriously as the medical crisis it was. By the end of his life, Barrymore couldn't remember his lines at all and required cue cards for every scene. He died in 1942 at 60. The industry that had laughed at his drinking for decades delivered warm eulogies. The irony was lost on no one. 6. Frances Farmer's story is one of Hollywood's most disturbing. A genuinely brilliant actress with real artistic integrity. She refused to play the game, clashed with studios, and developed a dependency on alcohol that the industry used as justification to destroy her. She was arrested multiple times, committed to a psychiatric institution, subjected to treatment so severe they are now considered human rights violations. Hollywood didn't just abandon Frances Farmer, it actively participated in her destruction. When she finally emerged years later, everything was gone. Her career, her health, her prime years. She died in 1970, largely forgotten by the industry she had once threatened to outshine. 5. Judy Garland's addiction didn't begin in adulthood. It was manufactured in childhood. MGM studio executives put her on amphetamines as a teenager to control her weight and keep her energy up for grueling shooting schedules. Then gave her sedatives at night so she could sleep, on and off, around the clock, for years. By the time she was an adult, dependency was already deeply embedded. MGM dropped her contract in 1950. The studio that had built her addiction from the age of 16 simply walked away when she became too difficult to manage. She died in 1969 at 47 from an accidental barbiturate overdose. The industry that had medicated a child for profit mourned her publicly. 4. William Holden won an Oscar for Stalag 17. He starred in some of the most celebrated films of the 1950s and 60s, and he was a severe alcoholic for most of his adult life, a fact the industry knew, worked around, and never once seriously addressed. Directors scheduled shoots around his drinking. Co-stars covered for him. The machinery of Hollywood accommodated his addiction because he was still profitable. In 1981, Holden fell during a drunken episode in his apartment, struck his head, and bled to death alone. He lay undiscovered for 4 days. One of the biggest stars of Hollywood's golden era found alone 4 days later. The industry had protected his image for decades. It hadn't protected him. 3. Lenny Bruce wasn't a traditional actor, but he performed, he appeared on screen, and he was one of the most influential entertainers of the 20th century. He was also relentlessly prosecuted for his art, arrested repeatedly for obscenity, and watched his career systematically dismantled by authorities, while the entertainment industry stood largely silent. The legal battles broke him financially. The stress accelerated his heroin dependency. In 1966, he was found dead at 40. Broke, legally destroyed, and alone. Years later, the same establishment that watched his destruction awarded him a posthumous pardon. Too late to matter. Right on time to feel good about itself. 2. River Phoenix was 23 years old and already one of the most gifted actors of his generation. Stand By Me, Running on Empty, My Own Private Idaho. The talent was undeniable and the trajectory was extraordinary. But behind the scenes, a serious drug dependency had developed. One that people around him were aware of. On October 30, 1993, he collapsed outside the Viper Room nightclub in Los Angeles and died of an overdose. He was 23. In the aftermath, uncomfortable questions emerged about who knew what and how long. The industry grieved loudly and publicly. The harder conversation, about the culture that surrounded young talent and the absence of any real protection, was much quieter. Marilyn Monroe is the most famous woman in Hollywood history, and her story is the most damning indictment of an industry that consumes people and calls it glamour. From the beginning, studio executives controlled her image, her contracts, and her schedule. She struggled with anxiety, insomnia, and dependency on prescription sedatives for years, a dependency that was known, accommodated, and never meaningfully addressed by anyone in power. She was passed between powerful men, dropped and re-signed by studios based on profitability. When she became difficult, when the anxiety became too visible and the dependency too obvious, the industry's patience ran out. On August 4, 1962, she was found dead at 36. The investigation raised more questions than it answered. Hollywood built a legend out of her tragedy. It had built the tragedy itself. 10 names. 10 careers, 10 human beings who were celebrated when they were useful and abandoned when they weren't. Addiction is not a character flaw, it is a medical condition. And for decades, Hollywood treated it as a personality inconvenience. These stories are not just sad. They are a pattern. A systemic, industry-wide failure to treat the people it profited from as human beings deserving of basic care. The industry has changed, slowly, partially, imperfectly. But these names deserve to be remembered not just for their performances. They deserve to be remembered for what was done to them. Which story affected you the most? Leave it in the comments, and follow FameFiles, because we don't just tell Hollywood stories. We tell the ones Hollywood hopes you forget.